So in today's video, we're going to show you how we made this terrarium float inside of another container. Did that sound too corny? Sorry, I'm having fun. Now I'm going to show you how, or what you're going to need really to make your own floating terrarium. You're going to need the basics of pretty much any terrarium. It's going to be, or at least for ours, we're going to have some gravel, a bit of sand, some of the fiberglass window screen, and then our choice of substrate and whatever plants you're going to put in here. Especially since these are going to be smaller terrariums, you really don't want like huge plants or even a large variety of plants. So maybe one or two mosses and another smaller plant. And they really need to do good with high humidity. But what makes this whole project unique, and the last thing that you need to do this, or to have in order to make it float, is going to be these little water beads right here. And we'll go into that a little bit more later. But first we're going to make the terrarium. So we're going to put this aside and work on the terrarium. The container I'm using here it's just an old hot sauce container actually. After we finished, or after we emptied the bottle, make sure to clean it out really well, especially if it's a hot sauce container. And if it has any sort of like little plastic or inserts on the lid, you may even want to remove those depending on how soft the material is. So just make sure you give whatever container it is a good wipe down. The first thing I'm going to be adding is a small layer of gravel to the bottom. That's way if there's any excess water, it has an area to go and pool in the bottom rather than in the soil above. Because if the soil gets too soggy, it can start causing issues with mold and just stagnant soil. So you want somewhere for the excess water to go. It doesn't have to be terribly big or a terribly thick layer. Just a little bit will help because you don't want to actually have like hardly any standing water in here. So you're not trying to create a reservoir, just an excess area for any extra. You're not purposely aiming to fill this area with water. Next, I'm going to use a layer of fiberglass window screen. And this is just going to help separate that layer from the soil so the soil doesn't wick that moisture up too readily. It helps keep it separated. You can do it without the soil, but especially with the layers thin as I'm doing in here, it does help to create that separation. There's a lot of people that actually will just put the rocks and then soil straight on top of it. But in this case, I'm not going to. Whatever you decide to use for the separation layer, you can just kind of set your container on top of it, have a surface underneath that you don't mind cutting against, and then just using a razor or an X-Acto knife, and you're going to cut it. A lot of the time it's nice to cut it a little bit extra so that it can kind of press against the walls. If it's too small, it will have a hard time actually creating a separation, but if it's too big, it will also have issues trying to fold up a little too much. I was grabbing the scrap piece and I forgot that this was already on the table. This is actually just a piece of spare linoleum floor. We got it from Lowe's. It was like in their scrap section. It was extremely cheap. So it works really well to just cut things on. So we like it and it kind of looks nice, I guess. It's also nice not having to worry about cutting into your table. You don't have to worry about it if it's perfect. A lot of this has a relatively decent room for error. To put this down inside, you can just roll it up in order for it to fit through the neck of the bottle. And if you have any difficulties getting it into position, because I highly doubt you're just going to drop it in and it's going to fall into place perfectly, you can use like kebab skewers you'd use for anything like barbecue or things like that. Sometimes the pointed end or the flat end can kind of push things a little bit more dramatically than you're hoping for since they're so pointy. You can also get kind of the permanent style metal skewers like this that have a rounded back side to it. Sometimes it's nice to have something a little bit more blunt to push whatever you're working on with. So this is nice if the opening of whatever bottle you choose is big enough to fit that, of course. Yeah. For the activated carbon, the main reason you want to add that layer on top of here is it just helps kind of filter everything that's going on here. Since it's going to be a closed environment and there's so much humidity in here, there is the extra chance of having mold and things like that just because it's stagnant, humid air. So one of the steps we do to try to kind of mitigate that is putting activated carbon in there. Any water that passes through it, it helps kind of filter out and keep it more clean. For ours, the pieces of carbon are actually pretty big. So especially for a container like this, I don't want them that large. So I'm going to be putting them in a bag and I'm going to be breaking those up. If your pieces of carbon not that big, you don't have to worry about this too much. Or if you're using a much larger container where you have kind of the ability to have a little bit more leeway with the layers, heights and stuff like that, it should be fine with those. I know this stuff can make a mess, so I just put it inside these bags and I'm not going to hit it up with stuff. I've seen people put it into like sheets or things of that nature. Odds are when I hit this metal spoon against the activated carbon, I'm probably going to put some little holes in these bags, but I'm going to do it this way. It's tougher than I thought. However you do it, whether you buy it or smash pieces of activated carbon up with a hammer or spoon, once you get the smaller pieces, we're just going to make a very thin layer on top of the screen. All right. The whole thing's slanted, but it looks good.
You did that on purpose, landscaping.
Yeah, because if everything was perfectly flat, it might look off or weird or like...
Too perfect.
Yeah, beauty and imperfections in these projects, you know? We've got our drainage layer, we've got the separation screen, and we have our charcoal. Now we're going to add the substrate. I'm using a mix that Serpa Designs has over on his channel. It's just a tropical substrate mix, and we'll leave a link to that. And it does a great job of holding moisture, but at the same time not getting too soggy and allowing excess moisture to still flow through it. So it allows the plants to grow with the moisture, but it also doesn't mold and get too soggy too easily. So that's what we're using here. I already had some that was growing, that was in one of my moss containers, and it has a little bit of moss already kind of mixed in with it, and then some springtails as well. And springtails are going to be probably the second most important thing you're going to add to this to try to stop mold. I mean, there's a very good chance that a lot of enclosed terrariums, as they're kind of settling in, do have a little bit of an issue with mold. But we're doing what we can to try to reduce that risk and make it as minor as possible. So this is the little bit that comes from the container that I have that already has some in it, or that already has springtails and then moss growing. And here's the bulk batch that we have mixed up of the rest of it. So I'm going to be putting in most of this first and then topping it with the other stuff. In the bulk mix, there is springtails in there as well. Just their concentration isn't quite as high because we haven't gone out of our way to really provide a ton of excess food inside of that container. But every time I dig down in there, I do find springtails just already in that. So that's going to help as well. If you don't have a funnel, just use anything. But it does help.
Paper.
Yeah, paper's probably a better choice than a thick piece of scrap linoleum. So these are little bits of the stuff I was talking about that already has some moss kind of building up in it, and a higher population of springtails already just inherently in it. So besides that moss, the only other plants I'm really going to be putting in here is just, not this whole piece, but a little bit of baby tears, and we have some Selaginella here, and it's very small, like interesting looking plant. A lot of people call it, was it spike moss? It's not actually a moss, it's more of a fern. So we have some of this we're going to be putting in as well. Doesn't always take the best when I try to transfer it, but I'm going to be trying to put this in anyways. So I'm going to put this in first, kind of pack it down, put a little bit of the other moss type in there, and then I'm going to add a stick as well as a little piece of the baby tear. A little piece of this moss, tuck it in, or on the other side. Perfect. Not really. Boop.
Perfect.
Yeah. Well, every time, perfect. Perfect landing. Always stick it. You can kind of roll up paper towel on the end of the loop of these things, and it makes it a little bit easier to clean off the inside walls. Because as you're putting dirt in here, especially if you don't use like a paper funnel, to make it easier, not get it all over the walls, you can use this to kind of push and clean the dirt off the walls a bit, especially in a container where there's no way you're going to be able to get your hand in there. This is working really well.
I'm just waiting for the moment when it unravels and comes off of it, and then it's stuck in there and you can't get it back out.
You don't say things like that.
That's how it happens.
Do you think it'll be cooler to have this part to the bottom or the curvy part on the bottom?
The fork on the bottom.
Okay, because whatever's at the top you really can't see.
Exactly. I think it'll help hold it in place too.
Yeah. All right. I really like the way that I think like the stick really just rounded it out. All right. The last little bit of trying to make a mess on your table. If you have a springtail culture, you can try to add springtails to it. If not, you can find springtails pretty much anywhere where you're going to find like isopods or pill bugs, basically. You can get them in a lot of like local reptile stores as well if they cater to more natural setups. And these are going to be just tiny little invertebrates that are going to help, like I said, mitigate the mold issues you might start having in these closed terrariums. Now, they aren't going to stop it necessarily, but they are going to be a very strong line of defense against minimizing it. Now I'm going to be adding some just by using a spoon with a little bit of water, because the nice thing about springtails is they float right on top of the water. So you can take a little bit of water from your springtail culture and you can pretty much just dump it right into the container itself. The stick is helping because I'm pouring the water down the stick, it's not hitting the walls. Now that I said that, it's going to next time though. You do want to be careful on this step because if you add too much water, you're going to start running into issues. So you don't want to go overboard with how many springtails you're trying to add because of the water. Adding water to a terrarium, treat it like adding salt to food. You can always add more if there's not enough, but if you add too much, it is really hard to take it away. So always be a little more cautious when it comes to adding water. It's better to leave it a little bit more dry than to add too much water. Now that I've made a mess and a terrarium, I'm going to show you the part that's going to make this float. But let me clean up the mess real quick and then we'll get to the floating part for this and how we're going to suspend this in another jar full of water. Let's make this thing levitate with some magic. Or water gel beads for gardening purposes. So with these water beads, we got these on Amazon, and a little bit of these go a long way. So with these water beads, I wasn't exactly sure how much I needed for what volume, and I wasn't really sure exactly how much I was going to need for the larger container as well. So just for giggles and grins, I have this half-gallon mason jar, and I took less than 1 tablespoon of this, and I put it in the half-gallon mason jar. And this half-gallon mason jar, you probably can't see it right now because it's full of water, and the beads is full up to here with beads, and from that same tablespoon, I had extra, so these go a long way. They don't take very long to fully hydrate, but what's neat about these and what's making this possible for our project is that once these fully saturate with water, they have the same refractive quality or index as water itself. And what that means is, like, if you put glass inside of water, like let's say you have marbles, you can tell it's there because the way the light passes through the glass is different than how it passes through water. But with these beads, the light passes through it the same way as it does water, so it makes it look like they disappear. And the nice thing about that is that they still are relatively solid. So these are going to help hold our terrarium in place while still looking like it's just water. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to be pouring some of the beads into here, and I'm going to empty out some of the water from it because I want as many beads in here as possible and as little water as possible. Since they're already hydrated, they're not going to be getting any smaller, so that's fine. So I want as many beads in here as possible because it's going to help hold this bottle in place. Some difficulties you might run into when doing this is if this bottle is too light and wants to float too easily, these beads are going to have a hard time keeping it down because although they have the same weight, or they're basically the same weight as water. So if this would float in air, or if this would float in water, it's going to try to float through these beads. So if they're not packed in holding it, it's going to float up through the top. So that's why I want to try to pack as many beads as possible in and then fill the last gaps with water. So this lid, it just so happens with the container we're using, has a nice little flip top. And it also has a gap inside this flip top, right here, then I was able to make a little screen with that mesh material I was talking about earlier for like crocheting or knitting. I still don't know what it's for, but I bought it. So I'm going to put this on top, open that lid, and then pour out some of the excess water. And this is also going to help it so that when I pour in the extra water at the end, once the beads are all in here, I've noticed that they try to float up a little bit almost. This is going to kind of keep those in place when I top it off with water as well. Probably going to spill because I don't think this is watertight. Yeah. The water I used for this was distilled water. I've never tried this with tap water, but tap water does have more minerals and the possibility that there might be stuff that things can grow on. With distilled water, there really shouldn't be any nutrients for algae and stuff like that to grow. So my aim in using distilled water to hydrate these beads is to try to prevent any algae forming in this water with the beads, because in order for this stuff to grow, it does need light, and that light has to pass through them first. So if that starts growing algae, you're not going to be able to see into this, and it's just going to look terrible, really. I love the way that looks.
Right around there, yeah. It's looking pretty good.
The beads look so neat to me. They're also very bouncy, so they can go everywhere when you're doing this. If you drop one on your kitchen floor, or if you have hardwood floor wherever you drop it, good luck finding it. If you have a cat, they might find it though. So now we're just going to top it off with water. We will have some air bubbles that we're going to have to kind of work out. I don't know if you can see them already, but this part I think is one of the most fun parts when you start seeing everything disappear, and hopefully it looks pretty centered. We'll see. Okay. I forgot about overfilling. I just got so excited watching it.
Did you get it? There's so many new bubbles.
So, shaking the container to get the bubbles out while it's wet, not the best idea. Come here, bubble.
Oh. That's smarter. Yeah,
Okay.
That makes sense. Yeah, we could just do that.
You know what? To get rid of air bubbles, shaking, not a good idea. Stirring with one of these rods, much better idea. Oh my gosh, that's so much easier. That took like 2 seconds. Through trial and error, done. And that's why we do these videos. That way I can make all those mistakes first. It makes it easier for you.